All right, I'm starting where it says the use of slave women. I'm going to start there. Right, the use of slave women as day workers naturally broke up or made impossible the normal black home, and this and the slave code led to a development of which the South was really ashamed, in which it often denied, and yet perfectly evident, the raising of slaves on the border slave states for systematic sales of the commercialized cotton plantation. The ability of the slaveholder and landlords to sequester a large share of the profits of slave labor depended upon his exploitation of that labor, rather than upon high prices for his product in the market. In the world market, the merchants and manufacturers had all the advantage of unity, knowledge, and purpose, and could hammer down the price of raw materials. The slaveholders, therefore, saw northern merchants and manufacturers enrich themselves from the results of the southern agriculture. He was angry and used all of his great political power to circumvent it. His only effective economic movement, however, could take place against the slave. He was forced unless willing to take power, lower profits, continually to beat down the cost of his slave labor. There was another motive, which more and more strongly as time went on compelled the planter to cling to slavery. His political power was based on slavery. With our 4 million slaves, he could balance the votes for 2.4 million Southern voters, while in the inconceivable event of their becoming free, their votes would outnumber those of his northern opponents, which was precisely what happened in 1868. As as the economic power of the planters waned, his power became more and more indispensable to the maintenance of his income and profits, holding his industrial system secure by this political domination. The planters turned to the more systematic exploitation of his black labor. One method called for more land, and other for more slaves. Both meant not only increased crops, but increased political power. It was a temptation that swept greed, religion, military pride, and dreams of the empire to its defense. There were two possibilities. He might follow the old method of the early Caribbean sugar plantations, for his slaves without regard to their physical conditions until they died or of overwork or exposure, and then by new ones. The difficulty of this, however, was that the price of slaves, since the attempt of to abolish the slave trade, was gradually rising. This is this in the deep South led to a strong and gradual increasing demand for the reopening of the American slave trade, just as the modern industry demands cheaper um, people from Indian labor in Asia and half slave labor in African mines. The other possibility was to find continuing increments of new rich land upon which ordinary slave labor would bring adequate return. This land the South sought in the Southeast, then beyond the Mississippi and in Louisiana and Texas, then in Mexico, and finally it turned its face into directions towards the northwestern territories of the United States and towards the Caribbean islands and South America. The South was drawn towards the West by two motives. First, the possibility that slavery in Kansas, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada would be at least as profitable as in Missouri. And secondly, to prevent the expansion of free labor there and its threat to slavery. This challenge was a counsel of despair in the face of modern industrial development, and probably the radical South expected defeat in the West and a hope that consequent resentment among the slaveholders would set the South towards a great slave empire in the Caribbean. Jefferson Davis was was ready to reopen the African slave trade to any future acquisitions south of the Rio Grande. This brought the South to war with the farmers and laborers in the North and West, who wanted free soil but did not want to compete with slave labor. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 vastly extended federal power so as to nullify state rights in the North. The comparison of the 1850 permitted the extension
Compromise.
of what?
The Compromise of 1850?
Thank you, of 1850 permitted the extension of slavery into the territories, and the Kansas-Nebraska Bill 1854 deprived Congress of the right to prohibit slavery anywhere. This opened the entire West to slavery. War followed in Kansas. Slaveholders went boldly into Kansas, armed and organized. Here's what they have to say. The invaders went in such force that the scattered and unorganized citizens would make no resistance, and in many places they did not attempt to vote, seeing the polls surrounded by crowds of armed men who they knew came from Missouri to control the election, and the leaders of the invaders kept their men under control, being anxious to prevent needless violence, and any serious outbreak would attract the attention of the country. In some districts, the actual citizens protested against the election and petitioned the governor to set it aside and ordered another. We can tell the impertinent scoundrels of the Tribune that we will continue to lynch and hang, to tar and feather, and drown livered abolitionists who dare to pollute our soil. Shut out from the United States territories by the Free Soil movement, the South determined upon secession, with the distinct ideal of individually expanding into the Caribbean. There was, however, the opposition of the border states. The employers of labor in the border states had found a new source of revenue. They did not like to admit it. They surrounded it with a certain scarcity secrecy, and it was exceedingly bad taste for any Virginia planter to have it indicated that he was deliberately raising slaves for sale, and yet that was a fact. So they're talking about breeding farms there. Wow. In no respect are peculiar uh, psychological difficulties of the planters better illustrated than with regard to the interstate slave trade. The theory of clear and lofty slaves were a part of the family. Quote, my people, quote unquote, George Washington called them. Under ordinary circumstances, they were never to be alienated, but supported during good behavior and and bad, punished and corrected for crime and demeanor, awarded for good conduct. It was the patriarchal clan translated into modern life, with social, religious, economic, and even blood ties. This was the theory, but as a matter of fact, the cotton planters were supplied with laborers by the border states, and laboring stock was deliberately bred for legal sale. A large number of persons followed the professions of promoting the sale of slaves. There were markets and quotations, and the stream of black labor moving continuously into the South, reaching earlier into the thousands, yearly into the thousands. Sorry. Notwithstanding these perfectly clear and authenticated facts, the planters persistently denied them. He denied that there was any considerable interstate sale of slaves. He denied that families were broken up. He insisted that slave auctions were due to death or mischance, and particularly did he insist that the slave traders were the last of human beings and most despised. The wait, yeah, this deliberate contradiction of plain facts constitutes itself a major charge against slavery and shows how the system often so affronted the moral sense of the planters themselves that they tried to hide it from it. They tried to hide from it. They could not face the fact of black women as broad mares and of black children as puppies. Ew, that's what they thought about them. Indeed, while we seek why we speak of the planters as one essentially unvarying group, there is evidence that the necessities of their economic organization were continually changed and deteriorating. Their morale and pushing forward ruder, noisier, less cultivated elements than characterized the Southern gentlemen of earlier days. Certainly, the cursing, brawling, gamblers were largely represented the South in the late 50s, 1850s. Evidence the inevitable deterioration. Hold on a second. Did I pause the thing? I think I did.
Did you pause what?
The music.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
gone.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start all over. I'm going to start. I'm going to start where it says certainly the curse, brawling, whoring gamblers, who largely represented the South in the late 50s, evidence an inevitable deterioration that overtakes men when their desire for income and extravagances overwhelms their respect for human beings. Thus, the interstate slave trade grew and flourished, and the demand for the African slave trade was rapidly becoming irresistible in the late 50s. From 50 to 80,000 slaves went from the border states to the lower South in the last decade of slavery. One planter frankly said that he calculated that the moment a baby of color was born, it was worth to him $300. Jesus Christ. So far as possible, the planters, in selling off their slaves, avoided the breakup of families, but they were facing flat economic facts. The person who were buying slaves in the Cotton Belt were not buying families, they were buying workers. And thus, by economic demand, families were continually and regularly broken up. The father was sold away, the mother and the half-grown children separated, and sometimes smaller children were sold. One of the subsequent tragedies of the system was the frantic effort before and after emancipation of black people hunting for their relatives throughout the United States. A Southerner wrote to Olmsted, quote, in the state of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, as much attention is paid to the breeding and growing of black people as to that of horses and mules. Further south, we raise them both from use and for the market. Planters command their girls and women, married or unmarried, to have children, and I have not known the great many black girls to be sold off because they did not have children. A breeding woman is worth from 1/6 to 1/4 more than one that does not breed. End quote. Sexual chaos arose from economic motives. The deliberate breeding of a strong, big field hand stock could be carried out by selecting proper males and giving them the run of the likeliest females. This is bad. This is proof that breeding farms didn't. This is another history of breeding farms. Breeding farms were horrible. So this was their solution. Wow. Childbearing was a profitable occupation, which received every possible encouragement, and there was not only no bar of legitimacy, but an actual premium put upon it. Indeed, the word was impossible of meaning under the slave system. Moncur D. Conway, whose father was a slaveholder near Fredericksburg, Virginia, wrote, quote, as a general thing, the chief precarian, precarianary, personary, I can't say that word. I'm gonna look it up, I guess. Pecuniary resource of the border state in the border states is the breeding of slaves. I grieve to say that there is too much ground for these charges that generally, licentiously, licentiousness, licentiousness among the slaves, for the purpose of a large increase, is compelled by some master and encouraged by many. The period of maternity is hastened. The average young, the average youth of black mothers being nearly 3 years earlier than that of any free race, and an old maid is utterly unknown among the women. End quote. J.E. Carnes, the English economist, in his passage with Mr. McHenry on this subject, computed that from reliable data that Virginia had bred, thank you, thank you, had bred and exported to the cotton states between the years of 1840 to 1850 no less than 100,000 slaves, which at $500 per head would have yielded her 50, oh wait, that says $50 million. The law sometimes forbade the breakup of slaves' families, but here's a quote: not one of these prohibition, save those from Louisiana, and they bought slightly, in any way referred to or hampered the owner and encumbered slave property. He might sell or pawn or mortgage or give it away according to profit or whim, regardless of age or kinship. Elsewhere, in the typical South, in Virginia, North Carolina, Southern Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas, there seems to have been no restrictions of any sort against separating mothers and children or husbands and wives or selling children at any age. Slavery has indeed in peculiar institutions. This is our like core foundations of what we do. We still do this shit. The slave trading border states, therefore, in their own economic interests, frantically defended slavery, yet opposed the reopening of the African slave trade, to which the Southern South was becoming more and more attracted. This slave trade was curious psychological effects upon the planters. When George Washington sold a slave to the Caribbeans for one hogshead, quote, of best rum, end quote, and molasses and sweetmeats, it was because, quote, this fellow is both a rogue and a runaway, end quote. Thus traditions grew up that the sale of a slave from a gentleman's plantation was for special cause. As time went on, the slavery became systemized and commercialized under the Cotton Kingdom. This was absolutely untrue. The buying or selling of slaves was not viewed as having any taint of hatred. Slave trading, yet it earlier became a full credited tradition, implicitly accepted generations after generations, that all traders were hated. The sacrifices necessary, hold on a second, okay, all right, have fun. The sacrifices necessary for economic advance, Southern planters were, on the whole, too selfish and too provincial to make. They would not, in any degree, curtail consumption in order to furnish at least part of the necessary increase of capital and make independence upon debt to the North and to Europe less necessary. They did not socialize the ownership of the slave on any large scale or educate him in technique. They did not encourage local and auxiliary industry or manufacturer, thus making it possible for their own profit to exploit white labor and give it an economic foothold. This would have involved to be sure, increased recognition of democracy and far from yielding to any such inevitable development, the South threw itself into the arms of a reaction at least 2 centuries out of date. Governor McDuffie of South Carolina called the laboring class bleached or unbleached, a quote, dangerous element in the population. A curious argument appeared in the Charleston Mercury in 1861. Here it is. Within 10 years past, as many as 10,000 slaves have been drawn away from Charleston by the attractive price of the West. The white laborers from abroad have come to take their places. These laborers have very disposition to work above the slave, and if there were opportunity, would be glad to do so. But without such opportunity, they come into competition with him. They are necessarily restive to the contact. Already, there is disposition to exclude him from the trades, from public works, from drays and the tables of the hotels. He is even now excluded to a great extent, and when more laborers shall come to greater numbers to the South, they will still more increase the tendency to exclusion. They will question the right of masters to employ their slaves in any work that they may wish for. They will invoke the aid of legislation. They will use the elective franchises to that end. They will acquire the power to determine municipal elections. They will exorbitantly use it. And thus the town of Charleston, at the very heart of slavery, may become the fortress and democratic power against it. The planters entirely misconceived the extent to which democracy was spreading in the North. They thought it meant that the laboring classes was going to rule the North for labor's own economic interest. Even those who saw the seamy side of slavery were convinced of the rightness of the system because they believed that there were seeds of disaster in the North against which slavery would be their protection. Quote, indication that these are already being to be felt or anticipated by the prophetic minds. They think they see in the demands for land lamentations and the anti-rent troubles in strikes of workmen, in the distress of immigrants, at the eddies of their current and diseased philanthropy, of radical democracy, and in the progress of socialistic ideas in general. The, quote, North, says they, quote, has progressed under the high pressures of unlimited competition. As the population grows denser, there will be terrific explosion, disaster, and ruin, while they will ride quietly and safely at the anchor of slavery. Thus the planters of the South walk straight into the face of a modern economic progress. The North had yielded to democracy, but only because democracy was curbed by the dictatorship of property and the investment which left in the hands of the leaders of industry such economic power as ensured their mastery of their profits. Less than this they knew perfectly well they could not yield, and more than this they would not. They remained masters of the economic destiny of America. In the South, on the other hand, the planters walked in quite an opposite direction, including the poor whites, from nearly every economic foothold, with apparently no conception of the danger of these 5 million workers who, in time, overthrew the planters and utterly submerged them after the Civil War. And the South was equally determined to regard its 4 million slaves as a class of submerged workers, and to this ideal they and their successors still cling. Calhoun once said, with perfect truth, there was never yet existed, quote, a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of the other, end quote. Governor McDuffie of South Carolina said, quote, God forbid that my descendants in the remotest generation should live in any other than a community having the institutions of domestic slavery, end quote. The South elected to make its fight through the political power which it possessed because of slavery and a disenfranchisement of the poor whites. It had in American history chosen 11 out of 16 presidents, 17th out of the 28 judges of the Supreme Court, 14 out of the 19 attorney generals, 21 out of the 33 speakers of the House, 80 out of 134 foreign ministers. It demanded a fugitive slave law, as strong as words could make it, and it was offered constitutional guarantees, which would have made it impossible for the North to meddle with the organization of the slave empire. The South was assured that all the territory southwest of Missouri and as far as north of California, it might even have extended its imperialistic sway towards the Caribbean without affecting opposition from the north of Europe or Europe. The South had conquered Mexico without help, and beyond lay the rest of Mexico, the Caribbean and South America, open to Southern imperialistic enterprise. The South dominated the Army and Navy, and it's argued that at large proportions of the population. Hold on a second. Okay. I hope I haven't made you mad.
I'm not mad. I just have a really bad headache.
All right, cool. The Southern dominated the Army and the Navy. It argued that a much larger proportion of the population could go to war in the South than in the North. There might, of course, be danger of slave insurrection in a long war with actual invasion, but the possibility of a long war or any war at all, Southerners discounted, and they looked confidently forward to being either an independent section of the United States or an independent country with the stable economic foundation which could dictate its terms to the modern world on the basis of monopoly of cotton and a large production of other essential raw materials. The South was too arrogant to know that their only chance to establish such economic dictatorship and place themselves in the key economic position was through a national economy and a large notion where a home market would absorb a large portion of the production and where agriculture, led by men of vision, could demand a fair share of profit from industry. When, therefore, the planters surrounded this chance and went to war with the machine to establish agricultural independency, they lost because of their internal weaknesses. Their whole labor class, black and white, went into economic revolt. The breach could only have been healed by making the same concessions to labor that France, England, Germany, and the North had made. There was no time for such change in the midst of war. Northern industry must therefore, after the war, make the adjustment with labor which Southern agriculture refused to make. But the loss which agriculture sustained through the stubbornness of the planters led to the degradation of the agriculture throughout the modern world. Due to the stubbornness of the South and the capitalists of the West, we have had built up in the world an agriculture with a minimum of machines and new methods conducted by arrogant laborers, ignorant, and producing raw materials used by the industry equipped with machines and intelligent labor and conducted by shrewd businessmen. The result has been that a disproportionate part of the profit of organized work had gone to industry, while the agricultural labor descended towards slavery. The West, instead of becoming a country of peasant proprietors who might have uh, counteracted this result, surrendered itself hand and foot to capitalism and speculation in land. The abolition of American slavery started the transportation of capital from white to black countries where slavery prevailed, with the same tremendous and awful consequences upon the laboring classes of the world, which we see about us today, when raw material could not be raised in a country like the United States. It could be raised in the tropics and semi-tropic under the dictatorship of industry, commerce, and manufacture, and with no free farming class. The competition of slave-directed agriculture in the Caribbean and South America, in Africa and Asia, eventually ruined the economic efficiency of agriculture in the United States and in Europe, and participated in the modern economic degradation of the white farmer, while it put into the hands of the owners of the machine, since a monopoly of raw material that was domination of white labor was more and more complete. The crisis came in 1860. Not so much because Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform which refused further land for expansion of slavery, but because the cotton crop of 1859 reached the phenomenal height of 5 million bales as compared with the 3 million in 1850. To this was added the threat of radical abolition as represented by John Brown. The South feared these social upheavals, but it was spurred to immediate action. But the great cotton crops, action by the great cotton crops, starting with South Carolina, the southern cotton raising and slave consuming states were forced out of the Union. Their reasons for doing this was clearly stated and reiterated for a generation. Belief in slavery was the southern, Shibboleth, Shibboleth. And here he goes. Here's what they're going to say. A suspicion of heresy on the subject of the peculiar institutions was sufficient to declare the ineligibility of any candidates for office. Nay, more orthodoxy began to depend upon the correct attitude towards the doctrine of squatter sovereignty and the extreme view held as to federal protection of slavery in the territories. That's the end of that part. Hold on a second. Jefferson Davis said that the North was impairing the security of property and slaves and reducing those states which held slaves to a condition of inferiority. Senator Toombs said that property and slaves must be entitled to the same projection from the government. From the government as any other property. The South Carolina Convention arraigned the North for increasing hostility, quote, to the institution of slavery. The declared for secession because the North and assumed the right of deciding upon the property of South domestic institutions. Governor C.R. Wickliffe, in his message at the extra session of the legislature of Louisiana, expressed his belief that the election was, quote, a deliberate design to prevent the powers of the government to the immediate injury and ultimate destruction of the peculiar institutions of the South. Slidell's farewell speech, and it's spelled Slidell, so it's a person, speech in the Congressional Globe of February 5th, 1861. They said, we separate, he said, because of the hostility of Lincoln on our institutions. If we were inaugurated without our consent, there would be slave insurrection in the South. No shit. No shit. The Alabama commissioner of Maryland arraigned the Lincoln government, was proposing not, quote, to recognize the rights of the Southern citizens to property and labor of African slaves, end quote. The governor of Alabama arraigned the Republicans for desiring, quote, the destruction of the institutions of slavery, end quote. In the Southern Congress at Montgomery on the 2nd of February, 1861, Senator Wigfall from Texas said that he was fighting for slavery and for nothing else. The patent of nobility is in the color of the skin. Ew. He wanted to live in no country in which a man who black his boots and curried his horse was his equal, giving black people muskets to make them soldiers. And the next subject introduced for the discussion will be I gotta look up this word, everybody. Fun word. I'll be right back. Miscegenation. Huh? Please say you got it. And that's what it is. A mix of different racial groups through marriage, cohabitation, or sexual relations. All right. And finally, Alexander H. Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, stated fully the philosophy of the new Confederate government. Here it is. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, American slavery, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the black person in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture of the present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the, quote, rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now the realized fact. But rather he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may hold on a second. I just lost where I left. And stands may be doubted. The prevailing idea entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the law of nature. That is was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or others in the older provinces, the institutions would be evanescent and pass away. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the idea of a government built upon it. When the, quote, storm came and the winds blew, it fell, end quote. Our government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstones rested upon the great truth that black people is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination of the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This is our new government. This is horrible. It is the first in this history of the world, based upon this great physical and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all other truths in the various departments of science. Oh my God, it has been so even amongst us. Many who hear me perhaps can recollect well that this truth was not generally admitted, even within their day. Now they are universally acknowledged. May we not, therefore, look with confidence to the ultimate universal acknowledgement of the truths upon which our system rests. It is the first government ever instituted upon principles of strictly conformity to nature and the ordination of providence. Providence in furnishing the materials of human society. Many governments have been founded upon the principle of certain classes, but the classes have been thus enslaved were the same race, and in violation of the laws of nature, our system commits no such violation of laws of nature. The black person by nature, or by the curse against Canaan. Oh, they're utilizing the Bible. Okay, so yeah, is fitted for the conditions which he occupies in our system. The architect in the construction of building lays the foundation with the proper materials. The guarantee. Then comes granite. Then comes the brick or the marble. The substratum of our society is made of the material fitted by nature for it, and by experience we know that it is best, not only for the superior but for the inferior race, that it should be so. It is indeed in conformity with the ordinance of the Creator. It is not for us to inquire into the wisdom of His ordinances, or to question them. For His own purpose, He has made one race to differ from another, as He has had, quote, one star to differ from another star in glory. Jesus Christ, what a fucking prick. What a fucking piece of shit. Fortifying their validation to keep black people enslaved, and utilizing Christianity to do so. That's fucking wild. The rift between the southern states and the border states was bridged by omission of all references to the reopening of the slave trade, and stressing the reality of the northern attack upon the institution of slavery itself. The movement against the slave trade laws in the southern South was strong and growing. In 1854, the grand jury of the Williamsburg District of South Carolina declared, quote, as our unanimous opinion that the federal law abolishing the African slave trade is a public grievance. We hold this trade has been and would be, if reestablished, a blessing to the American people and a benefit to the African himself. 2 years later, the governor of the state, in his annual message, argued for the reopening of the trade and declared, quote, if we cannot supply the demand for slave labor, then we must expect to supply with the species of labor we do not want, end quote, i.e. free right labor. Oh my gosh. The movement was forwarded by the Commercial Convention. In 1855 at New Orleans, a resolution for the repeal of the slave trade laws was introduced, but not reported by the committee. In 1856 at Savannah, the convention refused to debate the matter of the repeal of the slave trade laws, but appointed a committee. At the convention of Knoxville in 1857, the resolution declared it expedient to reopen the trade was voted down. At Montgomery in 1858, a committee presented the elaborate majority report, declared it expedient and proper that the foreign slave trade should be reopened. After debate, it was decided that it was expedient for any single state to attempt to reopen the African slave trade, while that state is one of the United States of America. Finally, that Vicksburg in 1859, it was voted 40 to 19, quote, that all laws, state or federal, prohibiting the African slave trade ought to be repealed. Both provisional and permanent constitutions of the Confederate States forbade the importation of black people from foreign countries, except the, quote, slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America, end quote. Nevertheless, the foreign minister of the Confederate States were assured that while the Confederate government had no power to reopen the slave trade, the states could if they wanted to, and that the ministers were not to discuss any treaties to prohibit the trade. Thus the planters led the South into war, carrying the 5 million poor whites blindly with them, and standing upon a creed which imposed the free distribution of government land, which asked for the expansion of slave territory, for restricting function of the national government, and for the perpetuity of black slavery. What irritated the planters and made him charge the North and liberal Europe with hypocrisy was the ethical implication of slavery. He was kept explaining a system of work which he insisted was no different in essence from that in vogue in Europe and in the North. They and he were all exploiting labor. He did it by individual rights. They by state law. They called their labor free, but after all, the labor was only free to starve if he did not work on their terms. They called his laborer a slave when his master was responsible for him from birth to death. The Southern argument had strong backing in the commercial North. Lawyer McConnor, of New York, expressed amid applause that calm reason estimate of the black person in 1859, which pervaded the North. And here's what this person said. Doing good. Now, gentlemen, nature itself has assigned his condition of servitude to black people. He has the strength and is fit to work, but nature, which gave him his strength, denied him both the intelligence and the same nature which denied him the will to work, gave him a master who should enforce this will and make a useful servant of him in a climate to which he is well adapted for his own benefit and that of the master who rules him. I assert that it is no injustice to leave black people in position into which nature places him, to put a master over him. He is not robbed of any right. If he is compelled to labor in return for his and to supply as just compensation for his master to return for the labor and the talent devoted to ruling him and to making him useful to himself and to society. What a douche. Yeah, so like they're naturally supposed to be that way. Of course the fucking bourgeois there that would be like, yeah, that makes sense. What the planters and his northern apologists did not really admit was that this exploitation of labor reduced to it a wage so low and a standard of living so pitiable that no modern industry in agriculture or trade or manufacture could build upon it, that it made ignorance compulsory and had to do so in self-defense, and that it automatically was keeping the South from entering a great stream of modern industry, where growing intelligence among workers, a rising standard of living among the masses, increased personal freedom and political power were recognized as absolute necessary. The ethical problem here presents was less important than the political and far less than the economic. The Southerners were as little conscious of the hurt they were inflicting on human beings, as the Northerners were of their treatment of the wildness. It is easy for men to discount and misunderstand the suffering or harm done others. Once accustomed to the poverty, to the sight of toil and degradation, it as easily seems normal and natural once it is hidden beneath a different color of skin, a different stature, or a different habit of action and speech, and all consciousness of afflicting will disappear. So like stigmatization to like justify what's going on, to keep it going. They're stigmatizing it. The Southern planters suffered not simply from his economic mistakes, the psychological effect of slavery upon him was fatal. The mere fact that a man could be under the law, the actual master of the mind and body of human beings, had to have disastrous effects. All right, hold on a second. Got to appeal again. It it tended to inflate the ego of most planters beyond all reasons. They became arrogant, strutting, quarrelsome kinglets. They issued commands. They made laws. They shouted their orders. They expected difference, and self-abasement. They were uh, chloritic. I gotta see this word, everybody. Come with me as I find out what a word says. Sorry, it's choleric and easily insulted. Their, quote, honor, end quote, became a vast and awful thing, inquiring wide and ins, insistent difference. Such of them, I don't know why it says such of them, as were inherently weak and inefficient, were all the more easily angered, jealous, and resentful, while the few who were superior physically and mentally conceived no bounds to their power and personal prestige. As the world had long learned, nothing is so calculated to ruin human nature as absolute power over human beings. On the other hand, the position of such power did not and could not lead to its continued tyrannical exercise. The tyrant could could be kind and congenial. He could care for his chattels like a father. He could grant indulgence and largesse. He could play with power and find tremendous satisfaction in its benevolent uses, like the white savior. I'm here to save you. Thus, economically and normally, the institution of the planters became intolerable. What was needed was the force of great public opinion to make him see his economic mistakes and the moral debauchery that threatened him. But here again, in the planter class, no room was made for the reformer, the reluctant, I can't say this, recalcitrant. The men who dared such thought and act were driven out or suppressed with the virulent tyranny reminiscent of the Acquisition and the Reformation. For these there was the similar peculiar way of escape that lay before the slave. The planters who could not stand slavery followed the poor whites, who could not stand black people. They followed black people who also could not stand slavery into the North. They were removed from immediate contact with the evils of slavery. The planters often became the copperhead, quote unquote, the theoretical campaign of a system which he could not himself endure. Frederick Douglass thus summed up the objects of the white planters. And here's what Frederick said. They just want to keep their slavery. They'll do anything to keep it. I understand this policy to comprehend five cardinal objects. They are these. First, the complete suppression of all anti-slavery discussion. 2. The the expatriation of the entire free people of color from the United States. 3. The unending um, perpetuation of slavery in this republic. 4th, the rationalization of slavery to the extent of making slavery respected in every state of the Union. 5th, the extension of slavery over Mexico and the entire South American states. This whole system and plan, and this is now back to the text. This whole system and the plan of development failed of its own weaknesses. Ending efforts has gone into painting the claim that the old South was idyllic beauty and social charm, but the truth is inexorable. With all its fine men and sacrificing women, its hospitality, its hospitable homes and graceful manner, the South turned the most beautiful section of the nation into center of poverty and suffering, of drinking, gambling, and brawling, an abode of ignorance among black and white, more assimil than any modern land, and a system of industry so humanly unjust and economically inefficient that if it had not committed self-unaliving in civil war, it would have degenerated into its own weight. They're saying even without the war, it probably would have destroyed itself. Got it. With the Civil War, the planters died as a class. We still talk as though the dominant social class in the South persisted after the war, but it did not. It disappeared. Just how quickly and in what manner the transformation was made, we do not know. No scientific study of the submergence of the remainder of the planter class into the ranks of the poor whites and the corresponding rise of the portion of the poor whites into the dominant proportion of landholders and capitalists has been made. Of the names of prominent Southern families in Congress in 1860, only 2 appear in 1870, 5 in 1880, and 90 prominent names in 1870. Only 4 survived in 1880. Men talk today as though the upper class of the white South is descended from the slaveholders. Yet we know by plain mathematics that the ancestors of most of the present Southerners never owned a slave nor had any real economic part in slavery. The disaster for war disseminated the planters. The bitter disappointment and frustration led to a tremendous mortality after the war, and from 1870 on, the planter class merged their blood so completely with the rising poor whites that they disappeared as a separate aristocracy. It is this that explains so many characteristics of the post-war South: its lynching and mob law, its murders and cruelty, its insensibility to the finer things of civilization. Here's a little James Ratti. Here's a little poetry, so forgive me. Not spring from us, no agony of birth is asked or needed in the crimson tide. Upon downslope of the world, we, the elect, are hurled in fear, in fearful power, in brief pride, burning at last to silence the dark earth, no spring. All right, that's the end of the planter class and how they were developed and where they went. Now we're going on to general strikes. General strikes. All right, anybody have any questions? I know right now Joe's got a headache, but anybody in the comments have any questions, anything? Probably not. It's all right. Understandable. But that's pretty wild. Oh. Admit there, they're going to call out all the people that still like engaged with that. Like, there's got to be families. Like, we should probably look at that. I wonder if they're going to go through. There's families that are probably, like, because of all that, are like the ruling class here. How the Civil War meant emancipation and how the black worker won the war by a general strike, which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force. When Edwin Ruffin, white haired and wild, they used the M word, fired his first gun at Fort Sumter, he freed the slaves. It was the last thing he meant to do, but it was because he was so typically a Southern oligarch. He did not know the real world about him. He was provisional and lived apart on his plantation with his servants, his books, and his thoughts. Outside of agriculture, he jumped at conclusions instead of testing them by careful research. He knew, for instance, that the North would not fight. He knew that black people would never revolt. And so war came. War is murder, force, anarchy, and death. It is end is evil, despite all incidental good. Neither North nor South had before 1861 the slightest intention to going to war. The thought was, in many respects, ridiculous. They were not prepared for war. The National Army was small, poorly equipped, and without experience. There was no file from which someone might draw plans in subjugation. The Northern armies entered the South. They became armies of the emancipation. It was the last thing they planned to be. The North did not propose to attack property. It did not propose to free slaves. This was to be a white man's war to preserve the Union, and the Union must be preserved. Nothing that concerned the amelioration of black people touched the heart of the mass of Americans, nor could the common run of men realize the political and economic cost of black slavery. Then, when, therefore, the Southern radicals, backed by political oligarch and economic dictatorship in the most extreme form in which the world had seen it for 500 years, participated sessions, that part of the North that opposed the plan had to hunt for a rallying slogan to unite the majority of the North, and in the West, and if possible, bring the border states into opposing phalanx. Okay. Freedom for slaves furnished no such slogan. Not 1/10 of the northern white population would have fought for any such purpose. Free soil was a much stronger motive, but it had no cogency in this contest because the free soldiers did not dream of asking free soil in the South, since that involved the competition of slaves, and what seemed worse than that of free black people. On the other hand, the tremendous economic ideal of keeping this great market of goods, the United States, together with all its possibilities of agriculture, manufacture, trade, and profit, appealed to both the West and the North. And that was then much more significant. It appealed to the broader border states. To the flag we pledged, all its foes we abhorred, and we ain't from the inward, but we are for the war. The border states wanted the cotton belt in the Union so that they could sell their surplus slaves, but they also wanted to be in the same Union with the North and West, where the profit of trade was large and increasing. The duty then of saving the Union became the great rallying cry of a war which for a long time made the border states hesitate and confine concession to the far South. And yet they all knew that the only thing they really threatened the Union was slavery, and the only remedy was abolition. It now, the far South had trained the astute leadership A comparison could have been made which, so far as slavery is concerned, would have held the abnormal political power of the South intact, made the slave system impregnable for generations, and even give slavery practical rights throughout the nation. Both North and South ignored, in differing degrees, the interests of laboring classes. The North expected patriotism and union to make white laborers fight. The South expected all white men to defend the slaveholders' property. Both North and South expected, at most, a sharp, quick fight and victory. More probable, the South expected to succeed peacefully, and then outside the Union, to impose terms which would include national recognition of slavery, new slave territories, and new cheap slaves. The North expected that all the treatment and demonstrations to appease its honor, quote unquote, the South would return with the right of slave property recognized and protected by geographically limited. But geographically limited, not by. Yeah. Sorry. But sanctions ignored black people. To the northern masses, black people was a curiosity, a subhuman minstrel, willingly and neutrally a slave, and treated as well as he deserves to be. He had no sense. This is how the North see them. He had no sense. He had not sense enough to revolt and help northern armies, even if northern armies were trying to emancipate him, which they were not. The northern shranks at the very thought of encouraging servile insurrection against the whites. Above all, it did not propose to interfere with property. Black people on the whole were considered cowards and inferior beings whose very presence in America was unfortunate. The abolitionists, and it was true, expected action on the part of black people. But how much? They could not say. Only John Brown knew just how revolt had come and would come, and he was dead. Thus, black people themselves was not seriously considered by the majority of men, North or South. And yet, from the very beginning, black people occupied the center of the stage because of very simple physical reasons. The war was in the South, and in the South there were 3,953,740 black slaves and 261,918 free black peoples. What was to be the relations of this mass of workers to the war? What did the war mean to black people? And what did black people mean to the war? There are two theories, both rather over elaborated. The one that black people did nothing but faithfully serve his master until emancipation was thrusted upon him. The other, that black people immediately, just as quickly as the presence of northern soldiers made it possible, left serfdom and took his stand with the army of freedom. It must be borne in mind that 9/10 of the 4 million black slaves could neither read or write, and that was overwhelming majority of them who were isolated on country plantations. Any mass movement under such circumstances was materialized slowly and painfully. What black people did was to wait, look at and listen, and try to see where his interests lay. There was no use in seeking refuge in an army which was not an army of freedom, and there was no sense in revolting against armed masters who were conquering the world. As soon, however, as it became clear that the Union armies would not or could not return fugitive slaves, and that the masters, with all their fume and fury, were uncertain of victory, the slave returned upon a general strike against slavery, but the same method that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. He ran away to the first place of safety and offered his service to the Federal Army, so that in this way it was really true that he served his former master and served the emancipating army. And it was also true that this withdrawal and bestowal of his labor decided the war. The South counted on black people as laborers to raise food and money crops for civilians and for the army, and even in the crises to be used for military purposes. Slave revolt was an ever-present risk, but there was no reason to think that the short war with the North could greatly increase this danger. Publicly, the South repudiated and the thought of its slave even wanting to be rescued. The New Orleans Crescent showed, quote, the absurdity of the assertion of the general stampede of black people, end quote. I got approved again, great. The London Dispatch was convinced that black people did not want to be free. Quote, as for the slaves themselves, crushing among the wrongs of Dred Scott, and Uncle can't say that word, most provoking, they cannot be brought to burn with revenge. There are spies for their masters. They ostensibly refuse to run away to liberty, outraged in starvation. And they work in the fields as usual. When the planters and overseers are away, the only white women are left at home, end quote. Early in the war, the South had made careful calculations of the military value of slaves. The Alabama advertisers in 1861 discussed the slaves as a military element of the South, end quote unquote. It said that, quote, the total white population of 11 states now comprised of Confederacy is 5 million, and therefore, to fill up the ranks of the Purpose Army, 600,000, about 10% of the entire white population will be required. In any other country than our own, such a draft could not be met, but the southern states can furnish that number of men and still not leave the material interests of the country in a suffering condition, end quote. The editor, with factitious faith, did not for a moment contemplate any mass movement against this program on the part of the slaves. Here's what it says, I think. Those who are incapacitated for bearing arms can oversee the plantations, and black people can go on undisrupted as their usual laborers. In the North, the case is different. The men who join the army of subjugation are the laborers, the producers, and the factory operatives. Yeah, nearly every man from that section, especially those from the rural districts, leaves some branch of industry to suffer during this absence. The institution of slavery in the South along enables her to place in the field a force much larger in proportion to her white population than in the North, or indeed any country which is dependent entirely on free labor. The institution is a tower of strength to the South, particularly at the present crises, and our enemies will be likely to find that the, quote, moral cancer, end quote, about which our orators are so fond of prating, is really one of the most effective weapons employed against the Union by the South. And that's the end of that. Real quick. How we're doing? We got 15 minutes. Soon, the South was of necessity was moving out beyond its plan. It was no longer simply a question of using black people at home on the plantation to raise food. They could be of even more immediate use as military labor to throw up beastworks, transport, and prepare food and act as servants in camp. In the Charleston Courier of November 22nd, able-bodied hands were asked to be sent by their masters to work upon the defense. Quote, they would be fed and properly cared for, end quote. In 1862, in Charleston, after proclaiming the martial law, the government and council authorized the procuring of black slaves, either by the planters' consent or by the impressment, quote, to work on the fortification of defenses of Charleston Harbor. In Mississippi in 1862, permission was granted to the governor to impress slaves to work in New Iberia for salt, which was becoming the Confederacy's most pressing necessity. In Texas, thousands of black people were offered by planters for working on the public defenses. By 1864, the matter had passed beyond demands for slaves as military laborers and had come to the place where the South was seriously considering and openly demanding the use of black people as soldiers. Distinctly, inevitably, the rigor of the slave system of the South softened as war proceeded. Slavery showed in many of its not all respect its best side. The harshness and the cruelty in part had to disappear since there were left on the plantation mainly women and children, with only a few men, and there was a certain feeling, an apprehension in the air on the part of the whites, which led them to capitalize on the friendship and kindness which had existed between them and the slaves. No race could have responded to this so quickly and thoroughly as black people. They felt pity and responsibility and also a certain new undercurrent of independence. Black people were still being sold rather ostentatiously in Charleston and New Orleans, but the long line in Virginia, black people were not marching to the Southwest. In a certain sense, after the first few months, everybody knew that slavery was done with. That no matter who won, the conditions of slave would never be the same after this disaster of war. Yeah. And it was perhaps these considerations, more than anything else, that held the poised arm of black men. For no one knew better than the South that black people, wild with cruelty and oppression and beaten back to the last stand, could do to his oppressor. Hold on a second. Remember, it's 97. If anybody's here, 97. 97. 97. 97. 97. Long ways to go. 97, 97, 97, 97. Whew. Yeah, there's a long ways to go. So I'm already on 108. 97. Go back to 97. Thank you for everybody for remembering. All right. So it looks like I'm just going to find a stopping point sometime. Oop, we're here. The Southerners, therefore, were careful. Those who had been kind to their slaves assured them of the bad character of the Yankee and of their own good intentions. Thus, while black people knew where there were abolitionists in the North, they did not know their growth, their power, or their intentions, and they did hear on every side that the South was overwhelmingly victorious on the battlefield. On the other hand, some black people sensed that was beginning to happen. Black people of the cities, black people who were being hired out, black people for intelligence who could read and write, all began carefully to watch the unfolding of the situation. At the first gun of Sumter, the black mass began not to move, but to heave with nervous tensions and watchful waiting. Even before war was declared, a movement began across the border. Just before the war, large numbers of fugitive slaves and free black people rushed into the North. It was estimated that 2,000 left North Carolina alone because of the rumors of war. When W.T. Sherman occupied Point Royal in October 1861, he had no idea that he was beginning emancipation at one of its strategic points. On the contrary, he was very polite and said that he had no idea of interfering with slaves. In some way, in the same way, Major General Dix, on seizing 2 counties of Virginia, was careful to order that slavery was not to be interfered with, or slaves to be received into the line. Burnside went further, and as he brought his Rhode Island regiment through Baltimore in June, he courteously returned 2 black people who tried to run away with him. They were, quote, opposed to be they were supposed to be slaves, end quote. Although they may have seen free black people, on the 4th of July, Colonel Pryor of Ohio delivered an address to the people of Virginia in which he repudiated the accusation that the Northern Army were abolitionists. So basically, the North was like, no, leave everything as, because we want that. Because they're making money. Keep the slaves, but get rid of the. Okay, that's weird. And here's the statement. I desire to assure you that the relations of master and servant, as recognized in our state, shall be respected. Our authority over the species of property shall not in the least be interfered with. To this end, I assure you that those under my command have peremptory orders to take up and hold any black people found running about the camp without passing from their master. So they're just returning them. Hellick, which I gotta get in Missouri, in 1860. Wait, that actually might be a good stopping point. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here. We're gonna stop on page 89. We're talking about how the North is not caring about the slaves; they just want the resources. So let me add a bookmark, and because that's a good stopping point. What? Page 89, 98. Sorry, 98.
98. Okay.
Yeah. All right. If anybody wants to come up and talk about it, it looks like the North is not all innocent. They want to keep the infrastructure going. They just want to be in charge of it. That's what I'm getting. That's what I'm getting. Anybody else want to come up, talk about it? Eh? Ain't me? No? Oh well. How's your headache?
It's still there, but
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
yeah, this is the way it went at first, and black people freed themselves. We didn't
Yep.
free them.
Nope. We wanted to keep them in the slave position because we saw them as objects instead of subjects or humans. They called them
Yeah.
species. The species that's meant to stay in slavery. And that's their
Right.
goal. That's their whole purpose of life. This is disgusting in my point. Which is very
Yeah.
disgusting. Yeah. Or comes Dooley.
Hello, sorry, TikTok was glitching.
That's all right. What would you like to say?
Um, yeah, the it was all of America, and this points that out. There was no good side when it came to the Civil War and the North and the South, because they were both colonizers trying to fucking have some sort of system of exploitation.
They wanted to maximize the profit and take away all that in maintaining the slave system. So yeah, I agree with that. And that's sad because that means really there was nobody besides these little itty bitty pockets. I heard even the abolitionists sometime were like racist as fuck too sometimes too. So
Yeah,
it's
they
just
were. They
yeah,
they just didn't
but
like slavery, but they didn't like black people either.
yeah. So like the whole what Frantz Fanon says is to free yourself and to like release your chains is important, you know. So I can understand to a degree the black person's position and not trusting anybody that's not black because of all these betrayals and stuff like that. So I can understand their position, you know. And I can understand indigenous positions too. But I don't know what it feels like, but I can understand it to a degree, you know. I'll never experience it. Anyways, anything else anybody wants to say?
Love you. Good night.
Okay.
America was never good. Much love. Take care.
All right, everybody, have a good night.